So my talk today is called Modeling Metaphor and Metaphor Comprehension via Analogy. And this is not just kind of a bow to the organizers of the Analogical Mind seminar. I've basically always been interested in metaphor as a form of analogy. And I'm going to do this talk in the following steps. I first give you quite a long introduction to how I see the field. Then I will present you with some more precise metaphor analysis. And I have three cases there: a case of conventional metaphor, a case of novel metaphor, and a case of what I call ambiguous metaphor between conventional and novel. And then finally, I have one slide that sort of spells out some of the prospects. So here's the introduction. First off, what do we share? I think that what we share is that metaphor is often defined as a form of analogy or cross-domain mapping. And the famous definition, of course, by Lakoff and Johnson is understanding one thing in terms of something else. And if that isn't an analogy, I don't know what it is. It's always been surprising to me that lots of people in the cognitive linguistic arena have not used the term analogy, but have used the term mapping or cross-domain mapping. I think there's a lot to be gained to build that bridge. And so examples, of course, include thinking about and talking about life as a journey, football as war, time as space, and so on. It's hundreds of these examples around. For those who are in literature, it's almost too boring to say this. For those who are coming from analogy, at least I think it makes it clear that we are roughly doing the same thing. These are non-literal or figurative analogies, as opposed to literal ones, such as, for instance, the Dutch trainer Louis van Gaal is the Pep Guardiola of Holland, or maybe the other way around. Maybe Pep Guardiola is the Louis van Gaal of Spain. I don't know which of the two. This also shows that comparisons always have a direction, and this is an important part of metaphor theory as well. So there is a problem. Metaphor as analogy in the structures and functions of language and thought is not related one-on-one to metaphor as analogy in the processes and products of cognition. Not every metaphor in language and thought is actually processed by analogy in cognitive processing. For instance, Sam Glucksberg and Dedrick Gentner have shown that many metaphorical expressions are processed not by analogy, but by lexical disambiguation. And I will show how this works in the main body of the talk. What this means is that metaphorically used words such as journey or war have conventionalized metaphorical senses. They don't only just mean literal journey and war, but also metaphorical journey and war that can simply be selected directly from the list of all senses that appear for activated lexical items in their minds. So the real question for me about metaphor research is, when do we need analogy to process metaphor in comprehension? Even though we define metaphor as analogy, the question arises, when do we need analogy in processing to comprehend metaphorical utterances, and when do we not? If you take a look at the vast field of metaphor research, there are actually various theories that take different positions on this. And so we need analogy, or the more extended notion of cross-domain mapping, all the time, according to conceptual metaphor theory, because in conceptual metaphor theory, the whole point is that we live from one domain into another domain, as it were. So we live because we see life as a journey. We live metaphorically lives as journeys. So that means analogizing actively as we use metaphorical expressions. We need analogy in cross-domain mapping some of the time, according to especially the career of metaphor theory. That's Dedrick Gentner and Brian Bowdle, but also class inclusion theory. That's Sam Glucksberg and his associates. And even the model of Walter Kinch, who does stuff on metaphor via latent semantic analysis, also allows for this variation in processing operations. So we need analogy either all the time or some of the time or hardly ever. And if you take a close look at what relevance theorists are saying, they basically say we just loosen one or two of the conditions under which you can use a particular word, and then you understand what is happening. And so that is pragmatic inference. And so basically the field is rather divided at the moment about how metaphor is processed and when it is processed by analogy. And this creates really a fundamental problem for metaphor research. And if Umberto Eco hadn't written this nice article called The Scandal of Metaphor in 1976, I think this is another scandal of metaphor, because basically it may be true that most metaphor is not processed metaphorically. Most metaphor may actually not require analogizing or cross-domain mapping when you comprehend sentences that have metaphorical items in them, but they may be solved in a different way. And so what we call metaphor in maybe the humanities or in linguistics, when we look at the structures and functions of sentences and texts, does not count as an analogy in cognitive science when you go to processing theories very often. And to me, this is a fundamental problem, because then the question arises, what counts as metaphor? So basically, this creates a paradox of metaphor if most metaphor is not processed metaphorically. And I feel that the cause of the problem is that most of the theories that we have been looking at so far are mostly based on language and thought, and language then as structure and thought, in a sense, as processing or as conceptual systems. And there's been a conflation or confusion, I think, between the two that has not been appreciated for what it is. And so what I have been trying to do since 2008, in 2008, I published the article called The Paradox of Metaphor. And that was the beginning of my work, which has now come to be known as deliberate metaphor theory. I did not call it that myself, but in 2015, Ray Gibbs published an attack on what I was assuming there, and he, for the first time, used the term deliberate metaphor theory. And from that moment on, I thought, okay, let's take the bull by the horns and let's create a deliberate metaphor theory. Let's take up this challenge. And so deliberate metaphor theory is formulated to resolve this paradox. And the basic claim is this: all metaphors in communication, that is, the process of communication between people, so all metaphors that count as metaphors between people are processed metaphorically by means of analogy. So if I use a metaphor and I want you to understand it as a metaphor, then it's also processed as a metaphor. It is possible, by contrast, that all non-deliberate metaphors, metaphors that are metaphorical in language and thought, but not in communication, are not processed metaphorically, but by lexical disambiguation. This is basically the starting point of my new ordering of the field. And so I'm adding communication to the dimensions of language and thought. And communication is important because it is about what speakers or writers intend their addressees to do with the metaphor. And that is precisely something that has not been taken into account sufficiently, at least, or at enough scale by the previous theorists. So I'm making the field more complex. This view would resolve the paradox, because then all metaphors that count as metaphorical in communication, deliberate metaphor, are metaphorically processed. And so if you say that the real metaphors are the ones that that function as metaphors between people, and they are metaphorical, there is no contradiction. And the other way around, the metaphors that do not count as metaphorical in communication, the non-deliberate ones, they are also not processed metaphorically, and this is also not needed. Okay, so I think that this view goes some way into making the scandal a little less scandalous, because technically, of course, all of these other words that are identified as metaphorical, in terms of cognitive linguistics and in corpus work, yes, they are metaphorical, but they are only metaphorical in a particular view, in a number of respects, and not in the one that is the most important one for language and discourse, namely the one that is, how do people communicate with each other? And so this is what I'm trying to elaborate in the book as well. So what we've done, and it's not just me who has done this, there's a couple of my associates who've worked on this, and lots of people have taken up on these ideas. And because of that, there is now a growing body of research that shows, first of all, that deliberate metaphor indeed exists, which some people still deny or some people still doubt. Again, just a little anecdote. In a conference in 2017 in Sweden, Ray and I are good friends, but Ray opened a question to a paper on deliberate metaphor by saying, imagine some bizarre world in which deliberate metaphor exists. And so to me, that was kind of, okay, I still need to fight the fight, and we still need to push the message. And so here is one example. Deliberate metaphor exists. It can be reliably distinguished from non-deliberate metaphor in language use and discourse. One of the big projects that we did in the past years has been developing a reliable deliberate metaphor identification procedure. This is the work by Gudrun Reinierse, and it actually has been tested, and we show that we can actually, when we first identify all the metaphors in the text, we can then also reliably establish which ones, according to our definitions, are deliberate versus non-deliberate. And that's also important. Because of that, we have also been able to see, we see a growing body of work that suggests that deliberate metaphors have typically different structures and functions than non-deliberate metaphors. So deliberate metaphors, for instance, are often expressed as similes, or the other way around. Similes are by definition almost deliberate metaphors because they signal that you have to do online a comparison. Deliberate metaphors also suggest an alien perspective in the discourse because they promote the perspective of the source domain much more, as it were, prominently than non-deliberate metaphors. And so we have been working on trying to get all of these aspects a little clearer as we go along. And so what we now need to do, because we haven't been able to do this at a very great scale, we need to move on to a study of processing. And I feel that the study of processing can only be undertaken, as it were, responsibly and precisely if we have a more explicit theory, and that is what I've been trying to develop in the past years and now written this book about. But there's still a lot of testing to be done also experimentally. And I think that we're going to see some exciting research in the next years. There are some experiments already, but they really need to be supported by more attempts and data. Okay, so what I'm trying to do in this book is make the connection with general discourse theories of utterances and their processing, because I don't think utterances that have metaphors in them are very special. They should, in principle, be manageable by general theories of how utterances are processed and how these are needed for building discourse representations. And so in my new book, I've developed DMT into a four-dimensional model. Until recently, the deliberate metaphor theory had 3 dimensions: language, thought, and communication. But in developing my thoughts, I have actually had to add a 4th one. I claim that all utterances, so each utterance in every context, involves 4 dimensions, namely the one of expression, where you use language; the one of conceptualization, where you activate concepts and build conceptual structures. The new dimension is the dimension of reference. So we use language and concepts to point to a model of the world and to build a model of the world. And that does not have to be the same as what is in the expression or in the conceptual structure. And finally, we use all of these 3 to interact with each other. So we use utterances to tell each other about states in the world, but also our attitudes towards that state in the world, asking questions, making commands, adding in modality, and so on. So to me, every utterance has these 4 dimensions, and this aligns with the construction integration model that I'm going to talk about in a second, by Van Dijk and Kinch, which is, no, we'll talk about that in a sec. So I've developed DMT as this 4-dimensional model. And just to illustrate this, make this a little more concrete, if you look at Shakespeare's famous line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" What are the 4 dimensions? Well, first of all, this is an expression of an underlying analogy between 2 entities, thee and summer's day. It's also explicitly signaled as analogical or comparative because of the word compare. Okay, so these are the linguistic aspects of this utterance. Conceptually, it's clear that all of these words set up or activate different concepts. There are 2 concepts to be compared, and there's also the concept of comparison itself there. So we can assume that it's not just the words, it's also the concepts in people's minds that need to be described and explained. What is happening referentially is that this sets up a picture of the world where there's a speaker who wants to set up a comparison between 2 referents, a person and a summer's day. Okay, and it's interesting that we don't know whether the person is a man or a woman. This is one of the great mysteries of Shakespeare's sonnets, leading to all sorts of interesting theories. Finally, the 4th dimension, the sender and the addressee of this line, so Shakespeare himself and us as readers, both understand that we have to do a metaphor. We cannot understand, we cannot say that we've comprehended this line completely and correctly if we don't get this, that Shakespeare wanted us to set up this comparison. So that's the communicative dimension. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, language, thought, reference, and communication. And all of these are dimensions of this utterance. And this, in principle, holds for every utterance in every text. In principle, every utterance in every text that has a metaphor-related word in it should be analyzed along these dimensions. And this gives you a complete picture of how a metaphor works. And the last 2, 3, and 4 clearly have to do with deliberateness, okay? Many metaphors could be there in 1 and 2, but not in 3 and 4. Seen as metaphorical. This is the point I'm trying to make. And this also means, of course, that many metaphors, sorry, the other way around, that deliberate metaphors are just a very small fraction of all of the metaphors that we see. We've done a lot of corpus work, and on average, we've shown that 1 in 8 words, and we simply talk about word level now, 1 in 8 words can be seen as expressing a cross-domain mapping. But of those 1 in 8 words, only 1 in 20 is used deliberately, metaphorically. Okay, so in 100 words, there may be 12 words that are metaphorical, but of those 12 words, so technically metaphorical, but of those 12 words, only maybe 1, but even less, half a word would count as deliberately metaphorical. These are the proportions. So you can see that saying that deliberate, and this actually, I think, aligns much more with the intuitions that people have that metaphor is not so very important. It doesn't occur very often. Whereas the metaphors we live by suggests that they're all over the place. They are almost 1 in 10, but only 1 in 20 of these 1 in 10 is used deliberately metaphorically. And that actually aligns with people's intuitions, I think, a lot better. And so we're trying to complicate the picture a little more in terms of how people experience metaphor in reality. What I've done in my new work is that I'm now also saying that deliberate metaphor theory can also be based in the distinction between fast and slow thinking that Daniel Kahneman has introduced. And why is this? Most metaphor research is only interested in fast thinking. And this is because it has a focus on non-deliberate metaphor use. And so it does experiments with little sentences in the lab. And I don't mean to put this down at all. I have great admiration for that work, and we wouldn't have been here if that work hadn't been done. But we're talking about milliseconds of difference between one condition and another. So all of this metaphor comprehension is super fast, and this is all across metaphor research. But deliberate metaphor use may also involve slow thinking. And so clearly, if we have to understand what Shakespeare really might have meant by "shall I compare thee to a summer's day," we're not done in 2 seconds. We might want to think, what is it that this metaphor really means? And then we might want to slow down, and then metaphorical thinking is a matter of seconds or sometimes even of minutes. And there's a lot of literary criticism about old texts that have extended across the centuries, and they're still not agreed about what a particular metaphor means. So we're really talking about slow thinking about important metaphors. And this is implicit in lots of, in an implicit issue in lots of text and corpus research. We don't know how long people take to understand a metaphor and to process it and to put it into the text, as soon as we are talking about slightly more complicated things. So I feel that all of this needs to be explained and approached from one encompassing theoretical framework, and that is what I'm trying to develop. Here's an example of variation between fast and slow metaphorical thinking, and now we have to do a technical feat, and I think the beginning works, but let's see how we can get back into the talk. So here's a commercial that is for a beer brand which was quite famous in the Netherlands 10 years ago. And I want to use it as an illustration of how fast metaphorical thinking can slow down. And it's supposed to be a little humorous and entertaining as well. Let's see if we can all get it. First, an advertisement for something else. You should ignore that. So now we're getting the real commercial. Can you all see it?
Nur mal am Text gearbeitet. Geil, oder?
Sehr gut.
Oh.
Scheiße. Warte mal. Stopp. Rocky Road. Das ist viel zu superficial.
Was ist los?
Life is a symphony.
Life is a cosmic symphony.
Life is a cosmic.
Es rockt nicht, wir sind underground.
Life is a
with black lights in the air. Das ist zu dark. Life is a celebration. Life is like a fire. Das ist ein scheiß Metaphor.
So.
Okay. So now, yeah. So the whole idea is that here you saw a bit of text design, a bit of metaphor design, and you can see them getting frustrated and getting slower and disagreeing with each other. And if there's any good example of deliberate metaphor use, here we're talking about deliberate metaphor use. And they were even talking about these are scheiß metaphor. They were aware that they were doing metaphor and that it didn't work. And so they eventually, funnily enough, didn't end up with a metaphor, but with a tautology, life is life. And that actually created a super hit. So this is, I think, a miniature version of how metaphor can work deliberately between the people in the band, but also between the lyrics and the audience. So I think that that's a nice illustration of the complexities, as it were, of metaphor use and how metaphor, and you can see that they were actually thinking analogically. They were also making comments on the various metaphors from the perspective of, so life is a tunnel with black light at the end. And then they said, that is too dark, life is a celebration. And so they were thinking analogically, clearly on the spot. So what this also means is that DMT is in addition also based in the distinction between metaphor in language use versus metaphor in discourse. And so we're talking about the difference between metaphor in utterances, but also clearly metaphors then have to work in text. And again, most metaphor research focuses on metaphor in language use again, and this is because of the focus again on non-deliberate metaphor use. That's not true because there's a lot of experiments that work on conventional versus novel metaphor, and novel metaphor is kind of deliberate, but still, deliberate metaphor use may also involve metaphor in discourse, from extended metaphor to allegory and parable. And here, of course, the Shakespeare example comes back to mind. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines. By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. So we get an extended comparison. It spells out all sorts of possible correspondences between the two domains. And it basically, these elements set up an argument for making the beloved more beautiful or less beautiful than a summer's day. So you really, this goes beyond one little utterance. You need to look at the utterances, but you also need to look at what the utterances do together in the text as the basis for an argument. So that's why metaphor clearly is not limited to simple utterances. It's a part of discourse, and we need to have theories of discourse to be able to deal with all of this variation between metaphor as well. And again, clearly, when you go from one utterance to the next, you do need to do analogical thinking. You cannot understand this at all without setting up online actively a big analogical structure between the two domains to keep track of what is said from one utterance to the next. So the title of my book is Slowing Metaphor Down, Updating Deliberate Metaphor Theory. It's now under review. I hope to get the reviews next week, and then I hope to do the revision in the next months, and hopefully it'll be out by next summer. It has 15 chapters. The first part is about exploring deliberate metaphor, so I review the available research. Then exploring deliberate metaphor theory, so I review what theoretically has been the issue, and then I present the new conceptualization of DMT, and finally I offer an operationalization, a new formal operationalization of DMT. So this is the plan, this is what I'm working on, and this is the basis of this talk. And so what I would like to do in the rest of this talk is to demonstrate this general model for utterance comprehension, apply it to utterances that have metaphor-related words, metaphor as defined via analogy again, and demonstrate how most of these utterances may work via lexical disambiguation instead of analogy, and then very briefly indicate further work that needs to be done. Okay, so this was the almost first half of the talk, and in terms of time, that seems to be kind of okay. Let's see how we are doing and how much stamina everybody has. Maybe this is a good moment to sort of take 1 minute of breath and see if there are any issues that need to be resolved before we can go on, or whether everybody is still on board. I'm looking at Matt and Margarita.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in. Okay, could you perhaps clarify what you mean by lexical disambiguation? That might be handy.
That's actually, I think I can clarify that by the next slides.
Okay, cool.
So that's coming up.
That's the only thing I think, yeah.
Okay, good.
I think we're good. I think we're good.
Shall we continue? Okay, good. So what I want to do is now, first of all, give you an impression of how DMT would set up a formal analysis of a conventionally metaphorical expression. And it's all based on lexical disambiguation. So first of all, I want to go back to the 4 dimensions. Basically, the 4 dimensions are based on the fact that when people understand or comprehend utterances, they set up 4 mental models for each utterance that are interacting with each other. And this is based on the construction integration model for language comprehension in discourse by Van Dijk and Kinch, which started in 1978. So first of all, they build a surface text which represents the linguistic aspects of the utterance. So they access the words, they identify the words, they combine them into clauses, into sentences. And if you don't know a particular language, you cannot even do that. If I hear somebody speak Chinese, I cannot make a surface text of what is happening in their language, okay? Secondly, sort of quite intimately related to the surface text is that the words give access to the concepts that are related to the words, and that concepts combine into little propositions. I will show all this in a minute. When all that is there, this projects a model of the situation that the sentence is about. So basically we have a bunch of references there that are combined in a state of affairs that you project for the world. And then finally, you situate all that in a context model where you say, okay, this speaker projected this state of affairs, this situation model, and he uses one thing to talk about something else. So you can say that there are topics, that there are perspectives, and that is done with regard to particular interests of both the speaker and the hearer. So to me, all of this sounds fairly natural, and it should apply to every utterance that is exchanged shared between people. Here's just a few comments. I won't go very deep into this, but first of all, discourse psychologists have focused on the relation between the text base and the situation model. So the second and the third dimension, because this is psychology. We're talking about concepts and reference, concepts and their relation to the world. The surface text is not deemed to be very significant for comprehension. This is even said explicitly in a review of the entire field by McNamara Magliano. And to a linguist, that sounds rather strange, but for the interests of discourse psychology, this is something that they've worked with for a long time without running into difficulties. The other way around, the context model, so the fourth dimension, has mostly been left aside. This is you could also say it's the pragmatic part of utterance use, and apparently this has not raised a lot of interest. Of course, there's discourse psychologists who look at this, but it's not been as well developed as the relation between the text base and the situation model. There's also a focus on text comprehension in doing this work on the text base and the situation model. So this is also clearly has to do with the experimental tradition. You can give people two versions of a text and you can check what's happening with the concepts and the reference. And that is something that is a main tradition in discourse psychology. And so it means that the production of language and discourse has also mostly been left aside from this perspective. And it's basically the reverse of the picture that we have for comprehension. You have to know, you have to have an intention, you have to know what you're talking, that's the communication, you have to know what you want to talk about, that's the world. You have to activate concepts that capture what you want to talk about, and you have to put that into expressions. And there's a very well-known model by a former Dutch psycholinguist called Pim Leveld, which was called speaking, that actually laid the foundations. So it's possible to do this, but it hasn't had as much attention as what we're talking about now in terms of comprehension. The relation to metaphor, all of this is clearly related to metaphors. If you look at what people do when they analyze metaphors, they focus on words, on concepts. They don't focus on reference and topic or perspectives, not until we started to talk about this. If you look at metaphor identification, we see that it's not just words and concepts, but people also look at the role of reference. So we discover the distinction between direct and indirect metaphor, and that all turns on reference. I will leave that aside for now. That will take us too far aside. And finally, deliberate metaphor identification. If you want to identify what counts as a deliberate metaphor, you need the relation between words and concepts and reference and perspective. So all four dimensions of metaphor. So what's the big question for DMT? How can we model metaphor comprehension in this extended CI model that has all the 4 dimensions spelled out and adjusted for our purposes? That's basically the challenge that I've tried to undertake in the book. And so what are the special issues for metaphor in the surface text, in the text space, in the situation model, in the context model? Here's a baseline analysis. In the surface text, we do basically get people build a linguistic representation of the language aspects of this utterance. Okay, this is an example from Lakoff and Johnson, and they, in their book, they highlighted the word electricity and said that that was metaphorical. What is interesting is that they did not highlight feel and they did not highlight between. But if electricity is taken in its literal sense, then the feeling becomes different as well, and the between becomes different as well. And so I think that those 2 words are also metaphorical, or not, depending how you can actually read this sentence in 2 ways. I could feel the electricity between us if there's been a big electricity discharge of some machine, or you can actually read it emotionally. Okay, so this sentence can actually mean 2 things. It's not presented as such in Lakoff and Johnson, but I think that the precise analysis shows that it actually is ambiguous. So if we go from the surface text to the text base, we break it down into little sets of concepts that are ordered in propositions. And this is a technical way of talking about the conceptual structure of utterances that is totally conventional for psychologists. So proposition 1 says that the speaker is able to do something which is P2. Proposition 2 says that the speaker feels electricity. And proposition 3 says that the electricity is located between the speaker and the addressee. Okay? And let's forget about the conventions here. What is interesting is that nobody in psychology has done this analysis. People have not looked at the metaphorical at the role of metaphor in the text space. They have not been interested in seeing whether electricity, in this case, for instance, is a concept that has 1 meaning or more meanings. And what I want to suggest here is that the language suggests that electricity may actually have more concepts related to it than just 1. And then in the situation model, we get the next issue. The speaker is able to feel something, but what is the referent? Is the referent real electricity, or is the referent emotional electricity? What is the situation we're talking about? And this is a question that, again, becomes explicit when you look at this from this 4-dimensional model. What is it that Lakoff and Johnson say is the meaning of this utterance? Do they say that the speaker feels the electricity and electricity means energy? Or do they say that the meaning of this utterance is that the speaker feels excitement? And so I feel that the theory for metaphor should be clear about which of the 2 meanings, or does it mean both at the same time? This is something that is not completely clear for everybody. And what I feel is that this formalism shows that these are real questions if we want to model how processing works. And finally, in the context model, since there is no context model in this formal way, I have developed a new way of talking about this. And this is a proposal for discussion in discourse psychology. The context model says that these 3 that language users represent this knowledge about the utterance, and what they also represent is that they know that the speaker intends something with these with this knowledge, namely that the addressee understands P1. And the other way around, the speaker also intends that the addressee recognizes that the speaker intended this. And this is of crucial importance because in some cases, the metaphor will come up at the beginning, and then the speaker intends for the metaphor to be understood as a metaphor. And in other cases, the metaphor comes up and the speaker doesn't intend this. Okay, so this is how we can show that in some cases, speakers intend to for hearers to understand the metaphor. In other cases, they don't. This is the formalism that allows for this. So this is the basic. This is the basic starting point. What can we say more about this? First of all, what can metaphor identification in the surface text, so technical metaphor identification in the surface text, add to this? How is this related to what is happening to the concepts in the text space, and what is precisely the referent in the situation model, and what is the representation of speaker and listener intention regarding the utterance in the context model? So I'm going to take you through, these are new details. If you go to the Webster dictionary and you see what the word feel means here, can you see my cursor? Yeah. So what the word feel has no fewer than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different senses. Okay, so feel, first of all, of course, means touch and perceive, but it also means passively experience or be affected by, conventionally. And it says MRW because that's our code for metaphor-related word. Okay, if you see feel in a sentence and it means be affected by, it's a metaphor-related word because it's metaphorically derived from touch and perceive. It's an emotion derived from a sense experience. And this is the analogical mapping, the conventional metaphors that Lakoff and Johnson talk about. And so you can see that in this sentence, there are already potentially, the second sense is potentially metaphorical, the third sense is, the fourth sense, and the fourth sense is, okay? For electricity, we see 3 senses: energy, energy and power, science of electricity, and excitement. Again, we have 2 non-metaphorical ones, and we have 1 metaphorical one. And between has no fewer than 7 senses. First is spatial, but you can also use between in a temporal way, in an abstract way, in a relational way, and so on. Okay, so what is happening when people build a surface text representation for a sentence is that they actually access each of these words and activate all of those senses automatically, unconsciously, within 0.2 seconds of comprehending the sentence. So all of those senses are there automatically. You just dig them up from your mental dictionary. So why would we need to use an analogy to build the metaphorical senses if they're already there in the mental dictionary? Okay, we don't have to do those analogical projections because they're already there. They've been done by millions of people before us. And so this is what then happens in the text space. And again, this has not been realized before. We do not just have one concept of feel or one concept of electricity or one concept of between. We have many. And we have a lot of them trying to work together to build intelligible propositions. So basically, all of this leads to a meaning explosion where all of these concepts are automatically combined with each other and tried out. And so, for instance, feel in the first sense here, feel in the sense of touch and perceive is automatically combined with electricity in the sense of energy. But feel in that sense is also automatically combined with science, and it's also combined with excitement. This is what the mind does, what the brain does. And so this leads to a meaning explosion, as it were, in the brain. And this is the construction part of understanding an utterance. This is why that model by Van Dijk and Kinch is called construction integration. So you get lots and lots of possible meanings for combinations of words. And this leads to a big activation in the brain that then has to come to a rest. And so when does it come to a rest? When we know what the sentence actually refers to. And so we select the appropriate combinations of concepts in terms of what are the reference. And so the speaker, in this case, we don't talk about touch or feel anymore. We say that the referent is be affected by. And we don't talk about electricity anymore, but we say that the referent is excitement. And this is precisely the intended meaning of the utterance, that the speaker is affected by the excitement between the speaker and the addressee. Okay, so at first we have all this metaphorical activation and non-metaphorical activation. That gets combined, but then you get lexical disambiguation, conceptual disambiguation, and referential disambiguation. You drop the irrelevant activated parts, and you then produce the picture of the situation model that is the only relevant and correct one, intended one. And this is what, of course, then the speaker intends. The speaker intends for the addressee to understand P1, namely that speaker is able to be affected by the excitement between the speaker and the addressee. Okay, and then this is the context model, and you see that there is no metaphorical perspective, there's only the emotional perspective. There's no activation of an electricity referent anymore. There's no activation of a feel referent anymore. There's only activation of the emotional ones. And this is the correct perspective. So because there's all of this is within one domain, not between two domains anymore, we've dropped the domain of electricity and feeling in the literal sense. And that is why this is a conventional non-deliberate metaphor. Okay, this is the basic story. And all of this is bringing stuff together in a way that has not been attempted before, but brings together research that is available for general language processing, in which lexical disambiguation, or even in general semantic disambiguation, is all over the place. Language has lots and lots of possible meanings, and we are super fast in getting rid of the irrelevant bits of meaning, and therefore then understanding what an utterance really means or is intended to mean. So for conventional metaphor, what we can say is metaphor in language and thought is defined as analogy, because that's how we can see that electricity actually comes from a different domain. But process analysis suggests how lexical disambiguation can deal with the selection of metaphor-related reference in the situation model without requiring analogizing in the first place, or online cross-domain mapping, to project them. We don't need to project them from the source because they're available. And this does project a coherent and relevant micro-world in the situation model and perspectivization in the context model. I think that this is, yeah. So this is the basic story. This is how I would look at what Lakoff and Johnson have boldly conjectured in the 1980s, and what has been basically been started to criticize by Dedrick Gentner and Sam Glucksberg, who showed that not all metaphors are processed in this way. And this is how you can almost computationally model this with reference to what is available in both metaphor research and in utterance and discourse research. And maybe this is a good moment to again take a little break or a little breath. I see that it's already 5:02. So I have one more case where I talk about the same example, but then as a novel metaphor, which is also possible. And then I can wrap up. But maybe I've put in a lot of new information in the past 15, 20 minutes. So let's check if there's anything that we need to come back to now.
I think.
Or should I go on? Just tell me.
I think, yeah, carry on unless anyone has any questions. Yeah.
Is it clear so far?
Very clear, yeah.
Okay, great. Then I'm going to surprise you because I'm now going to move on from conventional to novel metaphor. This little sentence, I could feel the electricity between us, is basically presented as part of a conceptual metaphor, love is a natural force. If as a linguist you look at this, the question is it really conventional or is it novel? If I go to 2 out of 4 dictionaries of English, British English, based on corpus analysis, then the conventional sense for electricity of excitement is not available. Okay, so electricity means just one thing, the natural force. It doesn't mean excitement. In 2 out of 4 corpus dictionaries. This means that people sometimes use electricity to talk about excitement, but that they use it so seldom that dictionary writers don't think it's an attested meaning for electricity yet. Okay? It means that the little utterance, I could feel the electricity between us, can be understood in two ways. The people who have excitement as an attested sense can use that, but the people who don't have that attested sense, they can only understand it as, I could feel the electricity, the force between us. That's a different meaning. Okay? And that is a meaning that is incoherent if you're talking about love, if you're not talking about real electricity. And you need to solve that by analogical thinking. Then you need to set up an online mapping. So I can use the same case as an illustration of the difference between conventional and novel metaphor. And in reality, actually, the same expression may work like that to different people, because those dictionaries can actually capture the mental dictionaries of some people versus other people. Okay? So from what I'm doing is I'm going from the dictionary, the American dictionary of the Webster, to a tool that is called W Matrix. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's an online, let us say, dictionary that also attaches semantic fields to words. And semantic fields are often used by metaphor scholars to stand for conceptual domains. So let me give an illustration. No, first, by the way, it should be noted that conventional or novel also involves non-deliberate versus deliberate. If a metaphor is novel, it is typically deliberate because the speaker clearly intends you to go to the source domain. And if it's conventional, then it's typically non-deliberate because the speaker then often intends you to go to the already available figurative sense. So if you go to, I could feel the electricity between us and apply W matrix, then W matrix attaches semantic fields to each of the words. And so as you can see in this example, for the word I, it attaches Z8, which is pronouns. For could, it is likely. For feel, it attaches E1, emotional action states and processes. X21, belief, thought, and sensory, and X3, sensory. So here you can see for feel, indeed, that we have a figurative and a literal semantic field assignment. For electricity, we get only electricity and electrical equipment. So there's only the semantic domain of natural forces, which I will use to project that there's only the conceptual domain of natural forces. And if you then have if you only have the natural force domain in a sentence that is supposed to talk about love, then it's incoherent and you need to solve that. Okay, so then we need a different solution than lexical disambiguation. Here we cannot do lexical disambiguation for electricity. So if we use all of this, and this is another addition that I'm putting into my new model, all of these semantic fields are there in the surface text because people know that a particular word comes from a particular semantic field. If they were linguists, but also intuitively, they know that particular words go together, okay? And so if we use that to build a similar text base, we see not only the different senses, but also the different semantic fields that we now use as conceptual domains. And we see that in those propositions, different conceptual domains are combined with each other. And this is also part of the concept combination process in the text base. But what happens when we go to the situation model, everything gets reduced to this question. The speaker is able to feel either in the referent of touching and perceiving, or in the referent of being affected by electricity, which only has one referent, namely natural force, O3. Okay, so the speaker feels or is experienced by electricity, but electricity is the natural force, and that is the problem that has to be resolved. What is the situation model about? Does he really feel electricity, or does he feel something else? And then that has to be resolved by analogical mapping. And so this is where lexical disambiguation cannot solve the problem anymore because the conventional sense and the conventional concept and the conventional referent are not there. You bump up against this problem, which you have to resolve and then you have to set up an analogical structure to project the intended referent at this stage. And that also then becomes part of the intention of the speaker and what the addressee needs to recognize. Okay, so this is a variant of the theme and simply is dependent on the availability of a conventional sense and concept and referent or not. Again, analogy, therefore, now is a solution that is to be triggered by the problem in the coherence. So when do we do analogy? When we have a problem. We don't do analogy when we have lexical disambiguation. That's, as it were, the default strategy. But if we have a situation model that is incoherent, we need to do something, and that is analogizing. It's no problem if there's no problem in coherence if lexical disambiguation is possible and the relevant sense is available already. Okay, so that is the contrasting case. That is what happens when we do novel metaphor and where analogizing comes in, and we need to have a mechanism for analogizing that is triggered by, as it were, a red light flashing up when we have a state of affairs, a situation model that is not coherent, that has a strange element. And that's why we also get an alien perspective in the utterance. Now, this would be conventional versus novel. Let us now finally look, and this is going to take 3 slides and then we're done. Let us now look at an utterance where it's not clear what is intended. And I call that ambiguous metaphor. And the same situation can resolve this kind of ambiguity as well. So here's an example. She died yesterday after a long fight against cancer. What does this utterance mean? Does it mean physical fight, or does it mean great effort? What does the speaker mean? We don't know unless we have more information. But in principle, this could be read in 2 ways. Metaphor scholars have not realized that these are actually 2 very distinct meanings, and that the one meaning stays within the domain of illness, where fight conventionally means great effort, and where the other one means we're making a metaphor, a deliberate metaphor, where we compare resisting cancer to having a fight against an enemy. And we actually intend for this comparison to be there in the meaning of the utterance. They are 2 very different meanings, I feel. So this utterance can be read as invoking a literal fight referent and perspective versus a regular disease-related effort referent perspective. I think this sentence can mean 2 different things, and we need to disambiguate. So the formalism can deal with this as well. If we look at the text space, we see all of the semantic fields still there, right? For fight, we see that there are 4 different possibilities: S8 minus, X8 plus, E3 minus, and K51. And X8 means trying hard, and E3 minus means violence. Okay, these are the two senses that I want to oppose here, that also activate 2 different concepts. If we then go to the situation model, we've got rid of all of the superfluous ones, but we still have to choose between the fight as trying hard or the fight as literally the case of violence. And so when we choose for the fight referent as trying hard, we don't have a metaphor. We just are in the disease domain. We are in a referential domain that has trying hard. When we have the fight as violent there, then we have a coherence problem in the same way as we had before. And we need to set up an analogical mapping, okay? And so if that happens, then we need to do something else. We need to say basically there's a similarity between P7 and P8. P7 says There's a against means determined attempt to prevent from getting worse, cancer. Okay, that's the disease sense. And here, this is similar to fighting against an enemy. Okay, this is the analogical structure that would be projected. This could be the meaning of this sentence. This could be the intention of the speaker, that we actually do this, that we see that fighting against cancer is a determined attempt to prevent from getting worse the cancer, and that it is similar to fighting against an enemy. And this might actually be the reading that people construct for this particular utterance. And it would, at least the possibility for this would be captured by the formalism again. So this is what the formalism can do, and how this, especially this P6, the similarity between P7 and P8 is triggered, is first of all because of the incoherence problem in the previous situation, and secondly, this is a mechanism that has been proposed by George Miller in 1979 in I think one of the most beautiful articles about metaphor that I know. And I'm using this as the mechanism, as a computational mechanism almost, to say, okay, we've got a problem in the referential situation. We need to solve it by setting up an analogy, and that is basically a similarity operator. And it becomes analogical because it's a similarity between two different domains. The latter solution is deliberate metaphor and requires analogy. The former is non-deliberate metaphor and can be handled by lexical disambiguation again. Okay, so this is basically the story that I have to offer. And then finally, just a few final comments. What I want to do in the future is to look at more cases and computational details and how to get from one mental model to the next. This approach models structure as well as process because it's computational. You have structural input and output via some computational operation. So I think it brings together the two fields of research quite neatly. It focuses on meaning and its creation, processing within the utterance. And all of this begins with fast thinking, with lexical disambiguation, but it can be slowed down in the case of setting up and understanding an analogy. So this is how I want to bring together most of these themes in the talk. Thank you. This is what I had to offer.